An expedition east in 1918 on the Trans-Siberian Railway enabled a man by the name Sergei Sergeyevich Prokofiev to escape the political turmoil and bloodshed of the Russian Revolution. What he thought would only be a temporary leave to America and Europe instead became 18 years of exile from his native country.
Immersed as I was in art, I did not have a clear idea of the scope and significance of the October Revolution, and hence the idea of America took root in my mind,
stated Prokofiev. With many of his original scores left behind in Russia, Prokofiev searched for a musical enterprise in the foreign capitalist countries that promised success. Prokofiev was not a man of social consciousness, a trait passed on to him by his father. He was born to Russian parents Sergei Alexeyevich and Maria Grigorievna Prokofiev on April of 1891 in Solntsovka, Ukraine. Little Yoshinka studied piano under his mother's tutoring. He progressed as his parents set him forth, becoming an apolitical optimist, disciplined academic, and a highly skilled pianist and composer. Prokofiev's musical mastery took him to St. Petersburg Conservatory, from which he graduated with top honors in 1914. By 1918, he already achieved great recognition as a virtuoso and composer both at home and abroad. It was 1918 when Prokofiev left Petrograd on the Trans-Siberian Railroad at the age of 27 during the Russian Revolution. The apolitical Prokofiev was ironically welcomed as that Bolshevik composer when he embarked his tour of America. He won great acclaim as a pianist, but his compositions received mixed reviews. A piano titan, steel fingers, steel wrists, Russian chaos in music, and Bolshevism in art were some of the headlines Prokofiev evoked as a pianist and composer. Prokofiev's response:
I have come here too early. The baby America is too young for new music.
Prokofiev encountered a conflict in the development of his career as a musician. He was determined to compose, but he had to sustain a living by performing. Prokofiev had an ambition to be recognized as the greatest composer in the world. Consequently, Prokofiev decided to move to Western Europe in 1920, having confidence that his career would better. Paris was the artistic capital of Western Europe in the 1920s. Prokofiev realized that his music was unreadily accepted in America because the American audience was not prepared for the avant-garde. In contrast, the audience in France yearned Barber's exoticism, but Prokofiev's music was considered too mild for their taste. In Europe, Prokofiev was highly in demand as a performing virtuoso, thus this produced a consistent income, though again, performing conflicted with his desires to spend more time composing. When in Europe, Prokofiev got married to a beautiful wife, Lena, a Spanish singer, and together they had 2 sons. Russian Soviet authorities, under the direction of Stalin, sent many letters to Prokofiev through his associates to lure him back to communist Russia. The letters appraised his musical compositions and informed Prokofiev about the popularity of his works in the land of Bolsheviks. As Stalin saw it, classical music was a very effective tool of propaganda. Stalin sought talented musicians to serve Marxist ideology. His goal was to portray these musicians as ideal representatives of socialism. Stalin tried to parallel the optimal musical technique of his musicians with what he wanted the world to perceive as a perfected industrialization of Soviet Russia. As Stalin said to his favorite poet Maxim Gorky, "Artists are the engineers of the soul." Prokofiev was not satisfied with the progress of his career in Western Europe because he could not overcome the talents of Rachmaninoff and Stravinsky. The Soviet government promised Prokofiev payment in foreign currency, a comfortable private apartment, and the permission to perform abroad. In 1936, Prokofiev's decision to make a permanent move to Soviet Russia became the greatest compromise of his life. The return would have a permanently damaging effect on his wife and children. What he thought would remedy the conflicts his career was facing in Western Europe would in fact bring more devastating conflicts than he could have ever imagined. His life in Europe was capitalist. He had to work as anyone else to earn a living. But in communist Russia, he was an elite. He could simply concentrate on composing. if he wrote under the direction of Stalin. An artist's life in Soviet Russia was privileged but repressed.
In some ways, socialism was a good thing, to the extent that socialism supported composers, poets, philosophers, and a whole host of artists, were employees like any other. In other words, it was easier to be an artist in the Soviet Union and have a higher standard of living than, let's say, it would have been in a capitalist society. But the price that those artists had to pay was that they had to create under the confines of socialist realism. So they had to accept a measure of censorship on their work. And if they could accept that, then they could have a career.
Many of Prokofiev's works were criticized and rejected by Stalin. His reason? Bourgeois formalism, anti-melodious content, a lack of understanding of Soviet heroism and Soviet humanity. Prokofiev tried to adjust his style to become more successful.
The greatest conflict that he could not overcome was reconciling his own artistic desires, aims, aspirations, with the demands placed on him by the Soviet regime.
In 1944, the film Ivan the Terrible Part 1 was released. It was a crucial key to Stalin's propaganda. Prokofiev and Eisenstein, a Russian film director, collaborated to make Stalin's mentor look like a model ruler. A total success it was for the two, Prokofiev and Eisenstein, when they completed the first part. Prokofiev received a Stalin Prize for this work. In all, he received 6 Stalin Prizes, more than any other artist in Soviet Russia. Then the two, Prokofiev the score writer and Eisenstein the director, collaborated for the second scene, the Boyar's Club, as Stalin commissioned in 1946. However, not endorsable by the view of the government, it was perceived as though Ivan was not valiant, but more of a paranoid tyrant. Stalin, furious with their creation, cancelled the whole production. Prokofiev and Eisenstein were then names on Stalin's hit list. Between 1946 and 1948, Stalin attacked outstanding cultural figures of Soviet Russia. He followed this with brainwashing, or as he referred to it, rehabilitation. All works by Prokofiev written abroad between 1918 and 1932 were banned. Under the Soviet system, he had no choice but to thank them for their wisdom and apologize for his formalism.
But with Prokofiev, who was so faithful to the regime, it seems his music and his attitude toward everything was so lined up with the Soviet requirements, it was kind of uneasy to accept that it happened to him, though it did, and it affected him very, very badly. It was, I think, years when, if there were no conflict before, it probably raised at that time.
From 1934 onward, all forms of art in the Soviet Union had to comply with the doctrine of socialist realism, of which Stalin was the co-author. Socialist realism is the basic method of Soviet literature and art, which demands of the artist a truthful, historically concrete depiction of reality and its revolutionary development. This definition is quite elusive and open to interpretation. With the government on his back, 1948 became Prokofiev's most challenging year. In 1948, Lena, Prokofiev's former wife and mother of his children, was arrested and exiled to Siberia. Shortly after this, Prokofiev suffered a stroke and would never fully recover. The tragedies and agony that the Eastern European people suffered, Prokofiev was able to project into his appreciable art of music. His musical creations, such as Peter and the Wolf and Romeo and Juliet, transcended cultures. Prokofiev astonished the world with his phenomenal talent and passion for composing. By the time his life came to an end in the grim world of Soviet Russia, Prokofiev had compromised his own personal freedom and the freedom of his wife and children in order to pursue his career.
My soul hurts,
were Prokofiev's last words as he died on March 5, 1953, coincidentally on the same day as Joseph Stalin.